Okay, well, last week we talked about natural revelation revealing why man is without excuse, and I mentioned that we might cover the rest of John Frame's book on natural revelation, but I decided not to. Not that it's bad material, but I think there was a different direction I wanted to go, but I would definitely commend that book to you if you still want to do some further research of your own. I can get the information to that. Instead, what we're going to do, and this is something that I love using as an apologetic device. And remember, apologetics is that study and discipline of giving a defense for your faith and for the hope that lies within you, is to talk about two men in the Bible. And these two men are Job and Solomon. And I'm of the conviction that the experiences of Job and Solomon illustrate why all mankind is without excuse before God, as we read in Romans chapter 1. Now, you might be asking, why Job and Solomon? Well, it's because these two men and their experiences embody two very extremely different ends of the spectrum of human experience. As you might remember, or if you don't, we're going to cover it in the next week or two or a couple weeks. Job is that figure in the Old Testament who was the subject of this heavenly debate between Satan and God, where Satan accused Job of only being a faithful and righteous man because God was treating him so kindly. That the argument was that people only serve God when they get stuff from God, and as soon as God turns off the faucet of his blessing, his heavenly blessings, then people will curse God. And so God, as a part of this testimony to us, turns on the suffering, allows Satan to afflict Job in many different ways, which we'll get into. And you could consider Job, I think, truly a man that suffered in some of the most grievous ways that anyone has ever suffered. That, in fact, he could represent all the sufferings that anyone's ever suffered in the world in one man, because he suffered material loss, his riches. He suffered the loss of his children. His wife left him. His heritage was gone. And then he even lost his physical health and was in tremendous physical pain and suffering. And worst of all, he was kept in the dark the entire time without any divine word or explanation of why these things were happening to him. So on top of all of those sufferings, those physical, mental, emotional, psychological, material sufferings, he had the worst suffering of ignorance, being in the dark. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you had Solomon. Solomon, who was the king of Israel, opulent, wealthy. He had all manner of opportunity and time and resources to do anything and everything that his heart would desire. And more importantly than that, God had gifted him with divine wisdom so that he, above all others in the scriptures, perhaps besides Jesus himself, had a wisdom when it came to the matters of life. So he had everything going for him, including divine knowledge. Job had nothing going for him, including a divine silence where he had no idea what was going on. And I think this is, again, just my own conviction that between these two men stands all of human experience. That we are somewhere in between that experience, between having everything and every opportunity, divine wisdom, and having nothing, and being without even any idea or clue what God is doing. And I think God in his wisdom then gives in the Bible the experiences of these two men that are so extremely, markedly different to serve as these two poles, which all of human experience will fall between. And I know that's a bold statement, but I think this is at least part of God's wisdom in giving us the story of these two men, that by including these two very extreme different experiences, human experiences, we can confidently say that these men had no excuse before God, therefore no one has any excuse before God. And we're going to start with Job, And then we'll move to Solomon. We're going to spend a little bit more time in Solomon via the book of Ecclesiastes, I think, than Job. Oh, we'll see. Maybe we can do Ecclesiastes, cover that in 1 week. We'll get there when we get there. All right, so the simple thesis today. In a reading of the book of Job, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but looking at Job from the lens of apologetics. Again, eliminating excuse for people to have for why they don't believe in God is this. Here's a simple thesis. Asking why already assumes a who. All right? Asking why already assumes there is a God. There is a who must give an explanation. Now, we're going to be in the book of Job. You can turn there if you like. But let me give you a little bit of background on this book. It's a fascinating book if you've never done a study of it. This is perhaps the oldest book of the Bible that's in the whole scriptures. You might say, well, why is it so far in the middle of the book? Well, you have to understand, the Bible is not arranged chronologically necessarily. Now, I know Genesis 1 does start with the beginning, but properly speaking, Job is somewhat mysterious. We don't know who the author is, and the events that it describes come well before the time of Moses. Let's say roughly speaking, Moses around 1500, using big round numbers, 1500 BC. Abraham, big round numbers, 2000 BC. This book seems to take place around the time of Abraham. And Abraham, we don't have any record of him having written anything down. Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy under inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He may have had some testimonies, some written documents and histories that were passed down that he brought together. And just like Luke, he brought together different witnesses and research and study he did to write the Gospel of Luke. It could be that as regards some of the history of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, people that Moses didn't know or talk to, that some of those things might have been passed down through the tribes, and he collected them, wrote them all out. Job perhaps was a book that was passed down, let's say, with the patriarchs, and so some say that Job, while not written by Moses, was the one that brought it into the canon of the Old Testament. It's got a really interesting history, but just to set it in a context, this is likely written, the events that happened were likely around the time of Abraham. It's definitely older than the time of Moses, and there's a lot of textual reasons why people think that. I won't get too much into the weeds with it, but one of the things that we see at the beginning of Job is that Job is offering sacrifices for the sake of his family. So he is the head of his house, offering sacrifices for his children and his household. There's no priests or priesthood, so that immediately kind of takes you before the time of Moses, right? Because it's the time of Moses where they instituted priests and sacrifices and all those things. So that's one of the indications. Another kind of indication, this is somewhat specific, is that at the end of Job, Job's daughters receive an inheritance, whereas in the Mosaic law, the inheritance has to go through the sons. You also have the fact that Job lived probably around 200 plus years, and Abraham lived 175 years. So in that time of history, people lived longer. So you have another indication this is not talking about the time of Moses, who died, I think, 120. Is that right? I might have that wrong. But you see the age spans getting less and less as you go on through time. So those are just some of the indications. Now, there's a question as to, is Job a parable? An allegory? Is it just a story that was passed on to describe this heavenly conflict and to address such issues of why is there suffering in the world and how can a good God allow evil things to happen and so on? Well, no. This is almost certainly at least intended to look and sound and be portrayed exactly as history. And one of the evidences is how did the prophets think of this book. And we only have one prophet refer to the book of Job, but here's what Ezekiel said. in Ezekiel 14:14. We'll start in verse 13, I guess. So the word of Yahweh came to me, that is to Ezekiel, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it and cut off from it man and beast, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord Yahweh. In other words, God is saying, your land is so wicked that even if you had these super duper righteous men like Noah, like Daniel, and Job in it, it would not have any kind of sanctifying or purifying effect on that land. They would be the only ones that God would spare out of it. Even though they're so righteous, you would think that they would have enough impact. But no, you guys are just too wicked. Now, Noah and Daniel, do we think they're literal people that live literally? Yeah, I mean, that's the way the Old Testament portrays it. So if Job is lumped in with Noah and Daniel, guess what? We're probably meant to think Job was a real, literal person, in which case the events of Job are intended to describe actual, literal, historical events that occurred around 2000 BC. Maybe before that, maybe a little after that. James 5:11 also has a reference to Job, where James is talking about the example of Job. It might be another indication, at least, that the New Testament apostles also thought Job was a real historical person. When it comes to the type of literature that Job possesses, it is what it's called wisdom literature. And that's why, at least in our Bibles, it begins our wisdom section that has, Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes and so on. And so that is a genre of literature that describes God's wisdom from a human perspective, you could say. There's a very human feel to all of the wisdom literature where human feelings, attitudes, and actions are intersecting and interacting with the divine. And what gets produced is sort of this poetry often. And so Job has a lot of poetic dialogue when it's not just talking about the narrative. Poetic dialogue means that there's poetry in it, a lot of imagery, word plays, metaphors, similes, and so you don't read that like you would a newspaper article. You read it as poetic language, figures of speech. If someone says, I am a light of the world, it's not saying, well, I guess they don't need, they don't need lamps anymore. No. It's a figure of speech. So we are intended to read this dialogue as poetic, but it's also dialogue, meaning that there are voices that are speaking and interacting with one another. And what's key to understanding Job is that you are going to hear Job interact with friends, and they're not always saying God's truth. Now, it's in God's word. It's recorded for us to know, but we don't assume that just because one of Job's friends said it, that it reflects God-given truth. Oftentimes, there's different shades and hints of meaning to it. So there's a lot of wisdom, ironically, involved in trying to understand. We won't get too much into that, fortunately, for our own purposes. But just so you know, God rebukes 3 of Job's friends at the end of their discourse, so obviously not everything that they said was good. Some of it was not very good advice at all. What is the purpose of the book of Job? Well, in general, I'm picking out sort of a specific purpose in it, but there is a broader purpose, and here I'm getting this from a man by the name of Parsons in his commentary. He says, the purpose of the book of Job is to show that the proper relationship between God and man is based solely upon the sovereign grace of God and man's response of faith and submissive trust. In other words, man asks, why did this happen? But God asks, who are you and who am I? God is not interested in always having to explain himself. He is sovereign. He instead calls into question the relationship. Who do you think I am? Here's who I am. Who do you think you are? This is who you are. And so from an apologetics angle, we are attempting, again, to show that people's whys must become who questions, Do you understand? When you're asking me why, in fact, what you are asking or assuming is that there's a who is going to respond to you. Faith, by the way, doesn't mean that we can't ask why, but to understand and realize that the real question of life isn't why are we here? It's who made this? Who is in charge? Who is the one that did everything? Whose plan is at work? It's a who question, not a why question. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. So we try to get people to stop asking why and to start asking who. So let's take the most obvious kind of question that we get out of a book of Job, and then we get from people who haven't even looked at the book of Job. Why do bad things happen? Or you could say, why do bad things happen to good people? Because after all, Job is exactly the story at the beginning, who is very prosperous, blameless, and upright. Verse 1 lays it all out, that he is one who feared God and turned away from evil. He is the pinnacle of a good person. Not perfect, because what does he do? He has to offer sacrifices. Well, you're only offering sacrifices if you sin, but see, part of being an upright, righteous, blameless person is not that you never sin, it's that you immediately recognize when you sin, and you go to the Lord and you ask forgiveness, and boom, you're a blameless person again, right? So he is keeping short accounts with God. He even does it for the sake of his children. So we are starting out very much so with a good person. Of course, the rest of chapter 1 describes how Satan comes and makes this accusation, not against Job per se, but against the very character of God. Verse 9, Satan says, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And Yahweh said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of Yahweh. And goes on, and there's disaster upon disaster. His sons start. Yeah, Nikki. Job chapter 1. Sorry. Job 1. So we have tragedy after tragedy befall the children of Job, and then all of his stuff is stolen and taken away, and then his very health is taken from him. You have the very famous phrase, naked I came, in verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. Yahweh gave, and Yahweh is taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. And then in chapter 2, he is afflicted in his health. He could handle all of his possessions, all of his children, and everything being taken from him. But now the poor man has his health afflicted, and he's in painful sores. The text says loathsome sores in chapter 2, verse 7, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So again, we're talking about a totality of physical suffering on top of the psychological and material suffering that he's experienced. And he's just, in ashes because he's mourning. And he's got pieces of broken pottery, and he's just scraping these sores. It's the only relief that he has. And of course, his wife says, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. So this obviously brings up a question, why? Now, we have had the curtain of heaven pulled back. We know that there's something of a test that's going on here. But Job does not know that. So in essence, from 3 all the way to chapter 3, I should say, all the way to chapter 37, all right, is Job in many different ways trying to say to his friends who are offering their advice about what's going on and why, saying, no, I don't agree with your why. Here's my why. And I don't know why, but I know it can't possibly be because that I've done something sinful. But he's got questions. He wants a chance to give his case before God. He wants to put God on, not the defensive, but he wants a chance to state his own case for maybe why he doesn't deserve this. But at the heart of it all is everyone is trying to answer a why question. His buddies thinks, well, here's why this is happening. You've got some sin in your life. Some hidden, sneaky sin is in your life, and you're not willing to admit it. That's why. So it's all about why. Now, this is very fertile, apologetic ground, because many people fall away from the faith because of this dialogue and question. Why did God allow this to happen? Why did, my child die of cancer? Why did I get into that car accident? Why did I lose my father at a young age? Why was I beaten, by someone I love? Why was I abused? Just why? All the time. And this is, I actually believe that there's not a whole lot of atheists, or maybe put this the other way. There's a lot of Christians who fall away from the faith because of not having an answer to the why question, okay? And many fall away from the faith because of this very dialogue. This is so important to have. And I've already kind of given you an answer today. We're just going to flesh out. But there's a very basic understanding we need to have that why implies who. Theologians, philosophers debate for millennia this question of why. But this ought to shock you. The main question isn't why. It is who. Look at chapter 38. Look at God's response. Now, we're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to skim it. So I would encourage you to open up there. So finally, after 30 some odd chapters, not that they thought of it as chapters, but after this dialogue, sitting with all of these friends of Job, finally God speaks. God is going to give an answer to the unspoken question, let's say, of Job's heart. How does he answer? Then Yahweh answered, Job 38:1, Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? I will question you. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who determined its measurements? Who stretched the line upon it? Who laid its cornerstone? Who shut in the sea with doors? Have you commanded the morning? Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? You know, you were born then, this is sarcasm, the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain? Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? Do you know the ordinance of heaven? Can you establish the rule on the earth? Can you lift up your voice? Can you send forth? Who has put wisdom? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Can you hunt the prey for the lion? Who provides for the raven its prey? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosened the bonds of the swift donkey? Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes? Will you depend on him? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain? Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck? Do you make him leap? Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up? Job, basically says, I'm speechless. I can't say anything. And then continuing in Job 40, verse 7, I will question you. You make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me? Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? Verse 30 or 24. Can you take him, that is these wonderful creatures of, I think, dinosaurs and other great magnificent creatures. Can you take him by his eyes? Can you draw out Leviathan? Can you put a rope in his nose? Will he make many pleas with you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you play with him? Can you fill his skin with harpoons? No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who can strip off his outer garment? Who would come near him with the bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? The question that answers all, doesn't make sense. Job is coming into this feeling like he needs to be persuaded about why God is doing something. That's his attitude. People will come to you with this attitude of, I need you to persuade me why things are the way they are. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? Why? Does God even try to address those questions? He's over here talking about the creation. He's talking about creatures of magnificent design and wonder. He's talking about the sun, moon, and stars, the oceans, the mountains, the rivers, dragons and dinosaurs, and all kinds of mighty creatures. He doesn't even give the barest recognition of the question that Job has. Why is this happening? Instead, what does he focus on? Who are you? Who am I? Do you know who you are? Do you know who I am? It's completely and utterly a who question that God answers. Think about what that means. Think about what that means. If you've ever felt stymied by by a question. Of course, the classic one is when children ask you something. Why are pizzas round? And you're like, well, it's just a geometrically, advantageous, shape. Or, well, why? Why is it, why is that geometrically? Well, I mean, it's just easy to just, and they'll start asking why, and why, and why, and why, and why, and why. That can go endlessly. If you've ever had that kind of, it's not just, cartoons. Like, that literally happens if you let them. And in a sense, if you want to never have to, if you need to have that why question answered, you can always ask another why question to forestall. So you can ask, I'm not saying you shouldn't answer someone's why question about why do bad things happen to good people or something, but understand that ultimately God says the question needs to at some point turn to who. You need to ask a question about who is in charge. So why did an earthquake destroy so many lives? Why, again, did my parents get divorced? All these why questions. But imagine this. If there's no God, if everything is a product of blind forces, purposeless principles, there's no point bothering to ask why. I can tell you the answer why. If God's not in the picture, the reason for everything, why, is that there was an inevitable, inexorable, unchangeable series of cause and effect conditions that produces everything we see. All of it is cold, callous, unfeeling, no intent, no design, no purpose. Therefore, you cannot be outraged over injustice. There's no reason to sorrow over death. There's no fault to find in others, because everything is just this calculation, calculation, let alone having to understand how everything started. Even if I give someone how everything, you don't have to explain that to me, atheist, how things started. But why do you need an explanation for why? You know the answer why, if you're an atheist. The answer to the question why is that there was no other way it could be, because everything is just a necessary chain of cause and effect, that is neutral, that is amoral. Not immoral, but amoral. No morality to it. Just the way, how mad do you get? Well, that's not a good example, because if you're playing pool, maybe you care. But you don't get upset when one ball hits another ball. There's no reason to be upset about that, right? But everything is reduced to just one thing hitting another thing ever since, however, all of this started. There's no such thing then as right, wrong, good, evil. You can't even ask, why do bad things happen to good people? Because you can't even say that things are bad or good. There's no beautiful, there's no ugly, there's no lovely, there's no righteous, there's no fixed meaning. It's just a godless existence, which means that asking a why question is utterly pointless. That's why it's funny when people try to use these why questions to disprove the existence of God, or when Christians lacking the answer to a why question abandon the faith. Because when they ask why, they have already made an assumption that things matter, that there are answers, that there is a right and wrong, good and evil, purpose and meaning. There is a standard to which even God himself must be held and given account. In other words, if you are saying, as a skeptic, if you're saying as someone who's gone to church, but you just went because your parents forced you to go, or your spouse, if all you ever knew was what you heard in Sunday school, and you never really gave it thought, and then you started thinking about all these why questions, and you realize, wait a second, I don't necessarily like the answers that I'm getting here, because it sure seems unjust for something like the situation Job to happen. That doesn't sound like a good God at all. That's basically tempting this poor man. You have actually held God to a standard on your own. Well, who does that make you? If you get to hold God to a standard that he must be held accountable to, who is God now? Well, it's me, because I'm saying God must have the standard. And as I think about it, God does not meet my standard. He's not, the Bible's not sufficiently, let's say, answering my why question. Therefore, there is no God. Well, the only way you came to the conclusion that there is no God is because who is God? It's you. When you ask a why question, again, it's not that it's inherently sinful to ask a why question, but if it doesn't very quickly turn into a who question, like Job, where you're like, oh yeah, hold on. I'm asking a lot of why questions, but my attitude is that I'm the one that can hold Pleiades and can put a harpoon through the skin of a Leviathan, and I can't do those things. I don't know when the mountain gives birth to its calves. I don't know those things. Oh yeah, it should put us in an immediate sense of humility when we ask why, as we consider who God is and who I am. But for the skeptic or the atheist, on what basis can they say anything's good or evil or propound about suffering without assuming that those definitions come from themselves, in which case they have made themselves God? That's why I don't think there's actually anyone that's truly an atheist. Because to make that claim and to set aside God, You have to be God. You have to be making a claim about yourself that you are in the position to say these absolute judgments about the existence of God and his nature. Or in other words, the debate is over as soon as someone wants an explanation for why. Basically, you can't even be asking that question without having presumed, again, either that you are God and God's the one on trial, or in another sense, without expecting an answer. Who asks why to a black hole? That black hole is not going to respond to you. Who asks why into the whirlwind or the tornado? Why are you destroying? That's what is interesting about, I won't get into all of that, but it starts with the Lord spoke out of the whirlwind. And it's supposed to be kind of this imagery of like an atheist, standing in front of a tidal wave, a tornado, a hurricane, a raging fire. Like, why are you messing this? What are you doing? Why are you destroying everything, ruining people's lives? That's silly. You don't ask why questions of inanimate objects. You don't ask why questions to forces of nature, especially when they're just cold, calculating, unfeeling processes, cause and effect. By the very nature of the fact that we as humans say, why is this happening? And get frustrated and fumble for those answers, it is already an indication that we think there ought to be an answer. And you're already assuming there's a God because you don't ask why to nothingness. You ask why because there is someone who's going to say, here's why. But in the case of God, what points to his sovereignty is that he doesn't answer the why. You shouldn't expect him to try and, let's say, not dignify, because it's not that Job is being not dignified, but think of what it would mean, in a sense, if God's voice was just that of another one of Job's friends arguing about the why. You see, God needed to answer in this way to point out who he is and who Job is, not to sit there and start, lawyering up about, well, why did this happen? Getting into an argument. No, instead, God simply, almost without any kind of acknowledgement, just gives him who he is and who Job is. So we're without excuse. Even in asking that basic question, why we betray that we want and expect answers from a who. And yet we would rather pretend to be the one who judges what is a reasonable answer or explanation and take the place of God. Well, guess what? That's the essence of sin. The essence of sin is to put God on trial and to say, God, you owe me an explanation, which is what Job is getting close to doing. God says that he didn't sin in anything he did, but you can tell Job was toying with that line of going from having a genuine concern about, say, his soul to making an accusation of God and sinning. Our own nature then betrays and exposes our sinful pride, our desire to pull down God from his throne so that we can replace him. And so as apologists, I want to, as we give a defense for the hope that lies within us, I just want to encourage you that you don't have to have an answer to every why. Now, as I'm thinking that we're going to address, let's say, common objections to Christianity and some apologetic arguments, probably at the end of all this. And so I'm not saying that there are not explanations. I'm not saying that's never relevant to sharing your faith as addressing the criticisms of, say, other religions or the arguments that atheists have. I'm only saying fundamentally the goal every time that you are sharing with someone a defense of the hope that lies within you, you ultimately have this goal of pointing them to a who. That your goal is not to just answer a bunch of questions, but rather to help them see, you got a lot of good questions here. a lot of why questions, would you be humble enough to accept that God has answers? That God is sovereign, and he must be, and I know he is kind and patient to answer, wanting to answer your questions, but do you know, doesn't it make more sense that God has some questions for you, just like he had for Job? Can you? Have you? Do you know? I think in a way that humility or the why questions of the world, which are good, have the intent to make us humble and not proud. Right? Children asks, why? Is it to accuse me? When my kids ask me why, no, it's because they don't know, and they expect me to have an answer. Their relationship is based on a trust that their dad is going to communicate truth and going to try and help them to understand something. That is the heart of asking why. And I think people need to be reminded of that. Atheists and skeptics and former Christians and, ex-evangelicals is what they're calling them now, is to be reminded, like you got a lot of good why questions, but are you willing to have the humility to say this is a who issue ultimately? But unfortunately, of course, people are tempted to be defensive and say that there are better explanations than God's explanations. But I don't think it's a bad thing when people have that why in their heart, so long as they realize there's a who that must be the one that they need to interact with here. So you're going to have a conversation about this or not. 1 Corinthians 1, 20 verse through 25. Look what God says. This is not just Job. This is not just a principle of the oldest book in the Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20 through 25. Yeah. No, verse 18. Start in verse 18, 1:18. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. We need to turn people's whys into a submission to the wise God. All right, I know that's a stretch, in terms of wordplay, but if you have a lot of whys, then you must turn to the wise God, whose wisdom is greater than the wisdom of men, that his foolishness is still wiser than our wisdom. We need to know him. And what did this wise God do? When he saw the world, he did something which we in our wisdom would never fathom. He saw sinners, and he opted himself to take the blame and the punishment for that sin. Here is a why that would have halted and shut Job's mouth if he knew this at the time. But in the wisdom of God, God sent his own son to take the burden and penalty of our sin upon himself. The problem that we created, God solved by him who knew no sin being made sin for us. That idea, I think, to Job, as he was sitting there trying to in his heart think, I know I'm a righteous man. I know I can vindicate myself if God would just give me the chance. If he were to behold the very notion that God himself would be the sacrifice, like he was making for the sake of his children and himself, you could have made Job like this big. But we do have this revelation. This is what should stop mouths. This is how you know whether someone's why question really is an evidence of a seeking heart or a self-justifying heart that wants to resist the notion of God. Is this God says that all things, all the wickedness and evil of the world, it gets reconciled perfectly in Jesus Christ, taking the sins of the world on himself and making everything right. That is the wisdom of God. That is the true why answer, and it points to a who, Jesus Christ. That is what we're trying to do with apologetics, is to turn all of these why questions into who, namely Jesus Christ. That on the cross we have the answer to these burning why questions. Now, you might not like it. There's a difference between not understanding and not liking it. An atheist can say, I reject that. That's not satisfactory to me. But all that is proving is that they are standing in judgment over God. They're God, not God. Okay, you're not an atheist, though, because you think you're God. Now, to me, that's crazy to think you're God, but at least just understand that you are saying you reject who God is and what he's done. But that's the essence of it. It's not that your why question hasn't been answered, you just don't like it. So, turning the why questions into a who question. That's a very simple thing, a lot of words to say it, but that is one, I think, apologetic lesson that we get from looking at Job, is all of our why questions are ultimately a who question. Next time, we'll see Solomon, that a world without a who is meaningless. That the pinnacle of an atheist thought or skeptic's thought or any religion that does not have the God of the Bible, ultimately it is meaningless, or as Solomon says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And we'll see how that impacts, how it impacts our apologetics. If the wisest, most rich, and resource-heavy man in the world came to that pinnacle conclusion, and then we'll do a little bit of maybe compare and contrast with that. So let me pray, and we'll close. Heavenly Father, I do pray, Lord, not that we would never have a why question or that people around us wouldn't have a why question, but that we'd very much feel that conviction that they must be turned into, oriented towards answering a who question. And Lord, we thank you even from this response. I don't know, it seems odd, but it's not, that you would confront Job in this way. With who you are, but that's really the answer at the end of the day for any of us. No matter what's happened, no matter what questions we have as we go to bed tonight, may we be comforted that we know who you are and we know who we are. And for those who put faith in you, we are children of God. We are loved. Maybe we can't figure everything out, but we know who we are because we know who you are. And so help us to grow deeper in that knowledge. Lord, help us to understand that better and better each day. And then help us to have that burden to bring who you are to all those whom we love as well. And pray that you'd bless our time together as we eat and enjoy our fellowship together. And we pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So thank you.